Hello everyone, welcome back. Today, the story of Tieu and CEO Hai continues, quietly carrying forward the unfinished emotions left from the previous episode. What has already happened is still there, not yet ready to be closed, merely stepping back to make room for heavier days ahead. In the last part, Tieu entered the final stage of her pregnancy, carrying within her a tangle of emotions. There were fragile hopes and silent anticipation, but also fears she could not put into words, fears that followed her quietly, day after day, night after night. This was not just the journey of a woman preparing to become a mother once again. For Tieu, this period felt like a long test, one that forced her to learn how to be stronger, even when she herself was unsure whether she could truly endure it. Every step in the final days of pregnancy was slow and heavy, yet beneath the exhaustion lay a quiet determination, for the small family she was trying so hard to protect. The delivery room door slowly closed, releasing a very soft sound that nonetheless echoed clearly through the empty space. In that exact moment, the world seemed to split in two. Outside was the long, cold corridor, where everyone could do nothing but wait in silence. Inside was a different journey, quiet yet full of trials, where Tieu had to face the final limits of her own strength alone. The silence outside grew heavy, almost suffocating. There were no footsteps, no voices, only the sense of time moving painfully slowly, minute by minute, stretching longer than it ever should. Behind that door, however, everything unfolded with an intensity and harshness beyond what words could fully capture. Tieu lay on the delivery bed, her body tense under the cold white lights shining directly overhead. The light made the ceiling feel distant and unfamiliar, as though she were in a completely different place, far removed from the warmth of her usual bedroom. Sweat soaked her forehead, sliding down her temples and into her hair. Waves of pain crashed over her one after another, powerful, relentless, sometimes forcing her to bite her lip, her hands instinctively gripping the bedsheets. There were moments when the pain grew so overwhelming that she felt she no longer had the strength to go on. Her breathing became rapid, her chest rising and falling with heavy effort. Yet each time the pain briefly subsided, even for a second, Tieu forced herself to take a deeper breath. She focused on her breathing, clung tightly to every instruction from the doctors, holding onto them like a fragile lifeline that kept her from being swept away by fear. At that point, her thoughts began to fade into fragments. Only two images remained clear, repeating endlessly in her mind. One was Ivy's innocent gaze, young and pure, yet always watching her with quiet concern. The other was CEO Hai's hand, the one that had tightly held hers not long ago, warm and steady, like a silent reminder that she was not alone. Those images anchored her. They kept her from giving up, even as her body reached the brink of exhaustion. Tieu told herself she had to continue, had to get through this moment, no matter how difficult it became. Time in the delivery room moved with cruel slowness. Every second stretched on, blending into waves of pain, hurried breaths, and rising tension. Tieu lost all sense of how much time had passed. She only knew she was moving forward, step by slow step, on a path with no way back. Then, after hours of strain that felt endless, a sudden sound broke through the heavy air filling the room. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everything seem to pause for a heartbeat. The first cry of a newborn rang out. "It's a boy." The words echoed clearly, like a marker that sealed the end of all the pain she had just endured. In that instant, Tieu burst into tears. They streamed freely down her exhausted face, not tears of pain or fear anymore, but tears of overwhelming joy after everything she had been through. The baby was gently placed on her chest. The tiny warmth against her skin made Tieu tremble slightly. She lowered her head, her eyes still blurred with tears. The small face appeared before her, rosy skin, soft breathing, fragile yet undeniably real. In that moment, all the noise in Tieu San's mind seemed to dissolve. She whispered softly, her voice trembling, almost no more than a breath. "Hello, my child." And those words quietly melted into the air of the delivery room, opening the door to an emotion not yet named. Outside the delivery room, as the door slowly opened, CEO Hai nearly stopped breathing. In that moment, all the sounds around him seemed to disappear. The hospital corridor was still brightly lit, people still passed by, yet to him, everything dissolved into a single stretch of silence, heavy and suffocating. He stood upright, his hands tightly clenched together, eyes fixed on the door that had just opened, as if blinking for even a second might make him miss the most important moment of his life. A nurse stepped out, a look of relief softening her face. That single smile was enough to send his heart racing. Then her gentle voice rang out, clear and steady. "Both mother and baby are safe. It's a boy." In that instant, all the worry and tension CEO Hai had been holding in for hours finally burst free. He stood still for a few seconds, drawing in a deep breath, feeling his chest loosen for the first time. His shoulders, tense for so long, slowly relaxed, not from exhaustion, but from the immense relief after a long, agonizing wait. When the nurse placed the baby into his arms, time seemed to slow. The tiny life fit perfectly against his chest, so light that he barely dared to breathe. He lowered his head, gazing for a long moment at the small, rosy face sleeping peacefully. Eyes gently closed, breathing soft and even, calm in a way that felt almost unreal. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. Never before had he felt responsibility so clearly, resting entirely in his arms. CEO Hai's eyes no longer held their usual tension. Instead, they grew deep and steady. He tilted his head slightly, his voice so low it seemed meant only for himself and the baby. "Your name is Kevil. From today on, Dad will protect you." The words needed no witnesses, no grand promises, yet they carried immense weight. He held Kevil a little longer, as if trying to etch this feeling deep into his memory, never wanting to forget it. Before leaving the hospital, Ivy was brought in to see her little brother. She walked slowly, each step careful, as though afraid of breaking the quiet atmosphere in the room. Standing close to the small crib, Ivy's eyes widened as she stared intently at the tiny baby inside. She didn't dare touch him firmly, only stood there in silence, her hands clasped together, her expression a mix of curiosity and caution. Ivy took her familiar teddy bear, the one she always hugged when she slept, and carefully placed it beside Kevil. Then she gently reached out, letting her fingertip brush against her brother's tiny hand. It was only the lightest touch, yet her gaze softened, as if in that brief moment, Ivy had understood something deeply important. Tieu San lay on the bed, watching every movement of her daughter. Her eyes were red, tears quietly welling up without her noticing. Seeing Ivy standing beside Kevil, Tieu San felt a bond forming silently, strong and unmistakable, even without words. She spoke softly, her voice still weak but filled with love. "Mom will bring you home soon." Ivy turned to look at her mother. She didn't say anything, only nodded gently. Then she stepped forward and tightly held her father's hand, her small fingers wrapping around CEO Hai's larger ones, as if entrusting him with all her worries, hopes, and the things she could not yet put into words. No one spoke, yet in that room, emotions quietly spread, slow, deep, and lingering, as though everything was still unfolding, not yet coming to an end. Outside the delivery room, as the door slowly opened, CEO Hai almost stopped breathing. In that moment, all the surrounding sounds seemed to vanish. The hospital corridor was still brightly lit, people were still moving about, but to him, everything collapsed into a stretch of silence so heavy it felt suffocating. He stood upright, his hands tightly clasped together, eyes fixed on the door that had just opened, as if blinking for even a second might cause him to miss the most important moment of his life. A nurse stepped out, a look of relief spreading across her face. That single smile was enough to make his heart race. Then her gentle voice followed, clear and resolute. "The mother and baby are both safe. It's a boy." In that instant, all the worry and tension CEO Hai had been suppressing for hours burst free. He stood still for a few seconds, drawing in a long, deep breath, feeling as though his chest had finally been released. His shoulders, tense for so long, slowly dropped, not from exhaustion, but from the overwhelming relief after a long wait. When the nurse placed the baby into his arms, time seemed to slow down. The tiny life rested perfectly against him, so light that he barely dared to breathe. He lowered his head, gazing for a long moment at the small, rosy face sleeping peacefully. Eyes gently closed, breathing soft and steady, calm in a way that felt almost unreal. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from emotion. Never before had he felt responsibility so clearly, resting entirely in his arms. CEO Hai's eyes no longer held their usual tension, but instead grew deep and resolute. He tilted his head slightly, his voice so low it seemed meant only for himself and the baby. "Your name is Kevil. From today on, Dad will protect you." The words needed no witnesses, no grand promises, yet they carried immense meaning. He held Kevil a little longer, as if trying to carve this feeling deep into his memory, never wanting to forget it. Before leaving the hospital, Ivy was brought in to see her little brother. She walked slowly, each step careful, as though afraid of disturbing the quiet atmosphere in the room. Standing close to the small crib, Ivy's eyes widened as she stared intently at the tiny baby inside. She didn't dare touch him firmly, only stood there in silence, her hands clasped together, her expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. Ivy took her familiar teddy bear, the one she always hugged when she slept, and carefully placed it beside Kevil. Then she gently reached out, letting her fingertip touch her brother's tiny hand. It was only the lightest contact, yet her gaze softened, as if in that brief moment, Ivy had come to understand something deeply important. Tieu lay on the bed, watching every movement of her daughter. Her eyes were red, tears quietly welling up without her realizing it. Seeing Ivy standing beside Kevil, Tieu clearly felt a bond silently forming, even though no one had put it into words. She spoke softly, her voice still weak but filled with love. "Mom will bring you home soon." Ivy turned to look at her mother. She said nothing, only nodded gently. Then she stepped forward and tightly held her father's hand, her small fingers wrapping around CEO Hai's larger ones, as if entrusting him with all her worries, hopes, and the feelings she could not yet express. No one spoke, yet in that room, emotions quietly spread, slow, deep, and lingering, as if everything was still unfolding, not yet coming to an end. The days after the birth passed slowly, as if time itself were deliberately stretching each moment so Tieu could more clearly feel the changes within her own body. After the difficult delivery, she was still very weak. Every time she shifted, every small movement brought a dull, lingering pain that forced her to close her eyes and breathe deeply to endure it. Her body was exhausted, yet Tieu did not complain. She simply adjusted, little by little, to the new rhythm of life that had just begun. CEO Hai barely left the hospital during those days. He stayed from morning until night, then continued through the long hours of darkness. From the smallest tasks, changing Kevil's diapers, preparing milk on schedule, carrying the baby back and forth around the room, to caring for Tieu during her recovery, he did everything with his own hands. His movements were still clumsy, and at times he hesitated, pausing for a few seconds to remember what to do next. Yet the care he put into every action made it impossible to look away. He moved slowly, carefully, as if even the smallest mistake might hurt the two people who mattered most to him. Some nights, the hospital grew unusually quiet. The hallway lights filtered into the room through the crack in the door, bright enough to see clearly, yet soft enough to keep the world half asleep. One time, as Tieu drifted awake, she slowly opened her eyes. Before her was the sight of CEO Hai sitting by the bed. One arm held Kevel close to his chest, while the other gently patted in a steady rhythm. The baby slept peacefully, breathing softly. Under the dim light, fatigue was visible around CEO Hai's eyes, yet his gaze was so gentle it softened the heart. Tieu watched him for a long time before speaking softly, her voice weak and barely above a whisper. "Aren't you tired?" CEO Hai looked up. His eyes met hers without wavering, and he gently shook his head. His voice was low and unhurried, as if he had carefully weighed every word. "I'm only afraid that you and our child might need me, and I wouldn't be there." The words were quiet, without grand promises, yet they made Tieu's heart tremble. She turned her face toward the window, pretending the light was too bright, hiding the hot tears that silently welled up. They were not tears of pain, but of gratitude, of feeling protected in a way she had not dared to fully trust for a very long time. That afternoon, soft sunlight filled the hospital room, bathing everything in a gentle golden hue. The space no longer felt as cold as it had in the early days. Tieu sat propped up against the bed, Kevel cradled securely in her arms. The baby's peaceful face seemed to quiet all fatigue. For the first time in days, Tieu's eyes held a rare sense of calm after so much tension and worry. CEO Hai stood beside her, saying nothing. He simply watched the mother and child, as if trying to carve this moment deep into his memory. He knew that simple moments like this would pass quickly, giving way to the many demands of life. But at least for now, everything was still whole. Elsewhere in the hospital, Ivy sat waiting, tightly hugging her familiar teddy bear. From time to time, she looked down the hallway, then lowered her gaze again, gently squeezing the toy in her arms. Ivy did not speak much, but the anticipation in her eyes was unmistakable, longing to go home soon, longing to be with her mother, and longing to stay close to her little brother just a bit longer. A small family was slowly piecing itself together. A newborn boy named Kevel, carrying countless unspoken hopes. And a new journey, quietly unfolding, still waiting ahead. The final months passed more slowly than ever. Time seemed to stretch within each windless afternoon, within the silent nights where only the steady sound of breathing filled the familiar room. Some nights, Tieu turned toward the wall, curling into her own private space, gently resting a hand on her belly as if by instinct. She whispered softly, words meant only for herself and the baby growing inside her. They were words of comfort, simple promises about the future, and fears she had never shared with anyone else. At times, exhaustion forced her eyes shut, her breathing growing heavier. At other moments, sudden waves of worry washed over her, tightening her chest as she thought of the tiny life slowly growing within. Each time, Tieu reminded herself to hold on just a little longer. Just a little more, until the day she could hold her child in her arms, until the unease could finally quiet down. And throughout it all, CEO Hai was always by her side. He did not speak much, nor did he try to do anything grand. His presence was quiet yet steady, like a wordless anchor. His hands often reached for hers, holding tightly, enough for Tieu to feel his companionship and the silent promise he made simply by staying. The day of admission arrived faster than Tieu had expected. Everything unfolded in a rush, leaving her barely any time to prepare herself before she had to face it. Outside the delivery room, CEO Hai stood close, his hand firmly clasping hers. That warm, steady grip carried a rare sense of reassurance amid the waves of panic rising within her. Tieu San looked at him. She said nothing, but in her eyes was absolute trust, the belief that he was still there, in that very moment, and that he would not leave. Down the hallway, little Ivy stood quietly. She did not run around or ask questions as she usually did. She simply stood there, her small hands clutching the hem of her clothes, eyes fixed on the closed door of the delivery room. Not a single word was spoken, yet within that innocent gaze lay worry, anticipation, and a deep love, for her mother, and for the baby brother soon to be born.
Cảm ơn tất cả mọi người rất là nhiều vì đã đón xem những video của mình nhé.
CEO Hai stood beside her, saying nothing. He
Tạm biệt mọi người, hẹn gặp lại mọi người trong những video tiếp theo.